Welcome to this online lesson on conflict with the Plains Indians. How did conflict with the Plains Indians develop from the 1860s? Now, the do now task I've got for you here is a say what you see picture quiz. Yes, they're supposed to be clues to significant events. This will be particularly tricky if you've not encountered this before and you're not doing this as revision, but nevertheless, say what you see and try and give it a go. Pause the video now while you try and work them out. Okay, how did you get on? Right, number one, what's that then? It's a cloud, but it's red. So it's Red Cloud. That was the name of one of the significant Indian chiefs during this period. What about number two? Alright, well this one strictly isn't actually from the 1860s. It's a later event that we're going to be covering in the next lesson. That's Wounded Knee, a terrible massacre in the 1890s. What about number three? Well, it might help if you know that that's a bighorn sheep. So what would that be in the corner? That would be a Little Bighorn, like the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. That's another event that will be in the lesson subsequent to this one. So if that's the Little Bighorn, what's number four? Well, that's a big crow, so the little one must be Little Crow. He's one of the other Indian leaders that we're going to be studying today. And the last one, and I'm particularly proud / ashamed of this one. Well, that's that first one. Is it the beach or is it just sand? And what about that second one? Why would you oil a door? What noise might that hinge be making? It's a creek. So that's Sand Creek, and that's another location of a massacre that we're going to be looking at today. Well, who knows? That might well be the funniest and most fun part of this entire lesson. I make no promises, but we might as well proceed. Let's see how we get on. So, the first large task that we're going to do is we're going to do some summaries of three major events. You can plot these on a timeline like the one on the screen, or you could even make a sheet like this of your own if you haven't got a copy of your own. They're going to be Little Crow's War, the Sand Creek Massacre, and Red Cloud's War. Now, if you're doing this for revision, I'm going to be going through some notes and some basic tips as to what these events involve. However, if you're learning this for the first time, it is really important that you research as much as you can for yourself and make as detailed notes as you can. So we're going to commence with Little Crow's War. Little Crow's War happened in 1862. At this stage, I'm going to encourage you to pause the video here. In the description, I've got a couple of links that can help you understand Little Crow's War, do some reading, make some notes, and see if you can fill in the headings that were on the previous screen. Once you've done that, I'll go through some basic answers here. But remember, this will only be covering the real basics, so you'll want to do some wider reading than this. As for that, pause the video now, unless you're just revising. Okay, let's have a look at the bare minimum of facts that you should have got down. So, Little Crow's War. Who was involved? Well, Little Crow was a warrior leader of a band of Dakota Sioux. That photograph there is Little Crow himself. What happened? Well, the Indians were desperately hungry. They had even resorted to eating grass as government agents refused to release any food stocks, claiming that the Indians had been breaking a treaty. Or rather, the claims that they had broken the treaty were the reasons why the government annuity that kept them supported hadn't been paid. Remember that an annuity was a common clause in government Indian treaties and was an annual payment that was paid to the Indians in return for the Indians following rules set down in the treaty. Little Crow initially resisted a war, not believing it possible to win, but then he led raids on the agencies and burnt down warehouses and led a general attack on white settlers on Sioux land. This was partly because he believed that the American Civil War would mean that the army couldn't respond. 700 soldiers and settlers were killed in these attacks. So where did it happen? It happened on the Dakota Sioux Reservation, which could be found in southern Minnesota. When? August of 1862, rather. 1962 would have been very different. August of 1862. And why? The Sioux's crops had failed due to disease, and their government annuity hadn't been paid. Little Crow also believed that the army wouldn't respond due to the Civil War. But ultimately, this is an act of desperation, driven by extreme hunger. Some more specific detail and important outcomes. 400 Sioux were sentenced to death at the end of the war, but only 38 with specific evidence against them were killed. This was on the direct command of President Lincoln. He didn't want to inflame relations with other Indian groups while the Civil War was still being fought. And so instead he insisted that only where there was proof that people had taken part in the killing of or rape of civilians, that they should be executed. The rest of the Sioux had to move on to the Crow Creek Reservation. This was a deliberate move. It was a small reservation and it was utterly barren. The government knew full well that the Sioux would not be able to survive there properly. Around 400 died of hunger in their first winter. As for Little Crow, well, a year later he died in a firefight with some settlers. He was later beheaded and his body thrown into a slaughterhouse pit. Not exactly happy stuff, but compared to the next one, well, you'll see. In the meantime, make sure that you've got all the basic details that you need, and if you have, we'll move on. Now we're going to have a look at the Sand Creek Massacre, which is event number 2. You by all means add this event of 1864 to your timeline, and now you can prepare yourself to fill in the same headings as you did for Little Crow's War. If it's the first time that you've looked at this, again there's a few links of reading that you can look at in the description, and I urge you to do that and to do as much wider reading as you possibly can, making notes as you go along under those headings. If on the other hand you're doing this as revision, we'll proceed shortly and have a look at the basic information. So if you're looking at it for the first time, now is the time to pause the video. Okay, assuming you've got the info down, let's check the basic facts, and if you're revising, this is what you should know. So the Sand Creek Massacre. Who was involved? Black Kettle, who was a leader of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, versus government troops led by Colonel Chivington. What was it? Well, US Army soldiers led by Colonel Chivington massacred over 150 Indians, mostly women, children and babies. Yes, this is a really brutal and awful crime. Women were raped, bodies were mutilated, and body parts were taken as trophies. And if you're wondering what body parts, we're talking about mostly heads, teeth, scalps, and even people's private parts. Really disgusting stuff. So what led to this absolute savagery? Well, it happened at Sand Creek in Colorado on the 29th of November of 1864. There had been conflict between the Indians and white settlers ever since gold was discovered in Colorado. That meant that gold prospectors had been trespassing on Indian land. Black Kettle had subsequently set up a camp at Sand Creek to discuss peace terms with Colorado Territory Governor John Evans. Evans had ordered Chivington to kill and destroy hostile Indians. It should be realised that Colonel Chivington was considered a Civil War hero, but his men had not yet been blooded in battle, and so they were getting all sorts of nicknames about being inactive. The fact of the matter is, Colonel Chivington was just looking for a fight. He wanted to argue that his men had won a great victory against the Indians. Well, instead, he set upon a group of surrendered and defenceless Indians. Here's a bit more specific detail. Chivington, after the event, was disgraced, but he crucially wasn't really punished. He was unable to fight the Indians during the Civil War. The government promised compensation and a large reservation, but they went back on this deal. Indian tribes heard about the massacre and the government's refusal to compensate the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and that further reduced trust. There's one further detail I'd like to draw your attention to. Have a look at the picture at the top right. This is an illustration that was drawn by an Indian later on. We can see one of the Indian men holding a flag. It is a United States flag with a white flag attached to it. This was done deliberately because the Indians understood that this was known to be a symbol of surrender and a symbol of submission to the American soldiers. It did not stop the onslaught. So, not exactly happy stuff, but I'm afraid to say when we're dealing with treatment of the Indians, especially in this later period, there's not going to be a lot of good news to look at all. So make sure you've got appropriate amounts of detail, and if you have, we'll move on to our final topic. Red Cloud's War of 1866 to 68. Again, now is the time to add that to your timeline. You should know the drill by now. Under the same headings as before, you'll find some links in the description that you can read, and now you can fill in as much detail as you can about Red Cloud's War. If you've not done this topic before and you're doing it for the first time, now is the time to pause the video. Okay, assuming that you've got your research done, or if you're just revising it, let's have a look at the basics. Red Cloud's War. Who was involved? Well, Red Cloud was a chief of the Lakota Sioux, and he was against the US Army and Captain Fetterman. What was it? Red Cloud fought to defend his land from white settlement and the US Army, who were building forts on Sioux land. Red Cloud therefore lured Captain Fetterman into a trap, and all 80 of his accompanying soldiers were killed by Sioux warriors. Basically, Red Cloud sent out a few scouts on horses, taunted these men in Fetterman's camp, and encouraged them to give chase. This they did until they were ambushed in a narrow pass, as you can see in the illustration at the top. The death of those 80 soldiers was the worst US defeat to the Indians yet. Where did it happen? Well, this happened on the Sioux lands and the Bozeman Trail, which was leading to Montana. It happened between 1866 and 68, but the main event that we remember is the 21st of December of 1866. So why was there fighting? Well, the Sioux were angered by the number of white settlers who were trespassing on Sioux land by using the Bozeman Trail, which was established following the discovery of gold in Montana in 1858. Note the similarities to the causes of Red Cloud and Little Crow's War here. Red Cloud had arranged to meet with the US government, but instead he launched a war on discovering that the US Army were already building forts on Sioux land before their talks had even begun. That was a clear sign that the US government were not going to be conducting those talks in good faith. So, what were the outcomes? I'm going to leave some of the detail until the next slide in this respect, but just consider this. The US government were actually shocked by Fetterman's defeat and agreed to discuss peace terms, partly because they wanted to try and convince the Sioux to just simply let the prospectors to cross their land. What this ultimately resulted in was a peace treaty, and this became known as the Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. We're going to be having a look at some of the details of that treaty very shortly. In the meantime, make sure that you've got appropriate amounts of detail, and if you have, then we'll move on. Let's consider the terms of the Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. I emphasise the second bit because it shouldn't be confused with the First Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Although that was also a peace treaty with the Indians, its terms are quite different. So, this is what essentially was outlined by this treaty. Note first of all that the US government appears to be agreeing to less than the Indians are, as usual. So the Indians agree to have Red Cloud lead his people back to the Sioux reservation. They also agree to never leave that reservation again, and they agree to not attack the US Army or settlers. Finally, they had agreed to sign this treaty, although very significantly Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused. These were two warlike leaders of the Lakota Sioux. On the other hand, the US government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail and prevent unauthorized white settlement of Sioux land. They also agreed to leave the Black Hills to the Sioux in perpetuity, which means forever, as a sacred site. Remember, the Black Hills was as sacred a site as any in the landscape for the Sioux. What you might consider here is this is the equivalent of, say, the centre of a religion. For example, let's imagine if you're an Anglican, it would be the equivalent of Canterbury Cathedral, or possibly even more significant than that. But the treaty isn't all that it seems. As usual, this is another case of the US government going back on their deal with the Indians. So, for every one of these points, there's a but. Although the Indians agreed to have Red Cloud lead his people back to the Sioux reservation, well, that was true, but some refused to go and they followed Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse instead. They also agreed to never leave the reservation again, but they followed the buffalo to hunt. They'd been led to understand that actually the buffalo would be, they would be able to hunt the buffalo, but that wasn't necessarily how the US government saw it. They also agreed not to attack the US Army, but conflict still happened when they came into conflict with, for example, settlers. And although they did sign the treaty, the fact that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse did not led to war and the Battle of the Little Big Horn, which we'll be looking at in detail in the next lesson. In addition, although the US government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail and prevent unauthorized white settlement of Sioux land, other routes by that point had existed, so the gold prospectors simply used other routes largely. Not only that, a railroad was built through the Black Hills. One further sneaky thing that the US government did is they essentially said that the Indians could continue to live on the reservation with the buffalo as long as they remained. As will become clear, that soon was not an option. Lastly, leaving the Black Hills to the Sioux in perpetuity was completely trampled all over. That railroad track being built through it might be the equivalent of an Anglican seeing Canterbury Cathedral knocked down with a bulldozer to build a new railway station. Not exactly the idea of respecting that land. Not only that, but when they were blasting the hills of the Black Hills, they found gold, and gold prospectors started flooding in. This was a perfect recipe for further conflict with the Sioux. So, your task. Summarise the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 in as much detail as you can. Then you could have a go at this exam-style question. Explain 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, and that's for 8 marks. Remember, consequences is trying to work out what happened as a result of this. So in particular, pay attention to what the treaty agreed and then the bit at the bottom where it says what really happened as a result, because that's how you'll answer the two consequences part. 2 point example, explain and link paragraphs would be perfectly sufficient for answering that question. Alright, if you want to complete those tasks, now's the time to pause the video. Okay, let's move on. In final summary then, you have 1 minute to list the main events that we have studied today in order, and 2 minutes to write a description for each of those events, and as a challenge to try and link at least 2 of them together. And lastly, to choose 3 adjectives to describe how the Indians were treated at this time. So in total, give yourself about 4 minutes to complete this. So once I've finished talking, you can pause the video, complete those tasks, and that will be the end of the lesson. At which point I must say thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much, and goodbye.